All right, so welcome to session 8. In this session today, we're going to be looking at interpreting data, and specifically, we're going to spend just a tiny bit of time talking about quantitative data because quantitative data is the type of data most of us are most familiar with. We're going to spend most of the session talking about qualitative data analysis, and again, we're spending most of our time doing that because it's the type of data analysis that probably most of us have had less experience with than quantitative data analysis. Next week, we're going to be talking about creating usable knowledge, and essentially, we're going to be talking about how we write narratives around the results that we're getting from our data. So, our question today is, how do I analyze my data? And again, we're still waiting for Georgette. As far as we know, she will be joining us. Chantal is not joining us today, and Anjali is going to be leaving at approximately 4:30 our time. All right, really quickly, the two big types of data that we generate as part of action research projects or as part of teaching practice generally is qualitative data and quantitative data. And when we talk about qualitative data, we're talking about descriptive data, typically in text form, or it could also be in video form or in audio form. When we're talking about quantitative data, we're talking about data that we collect in numbers. And I wanted, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about quantitative data, but just point out that when we are talking about those numbers, that we could be talking about discrete data. And by discrete data, we mean data that you can count. And an interesting thing about discrete data is that it tends to be represented using bar graphs. So again, when you think about using a bar graph for something, you're probably mapping discrete data. Continuous data is something that we measure. And of course, one of the things that we measure all the time is academic progress. And continuous data tends to be graphed using line graphs rather than bar graphs. So again, you can think about different types of data that you've seen represented in graphs. And just even based on the type of graph you're using, you can you get some insight into whether or not that data is discrete or continuous. When, again, talking about quantitative data, the data that all of us are familiar with would be things like MAP test scores. MAP test scores are quantitative. They're quantitative, they're not only quantitative, but they are often processed using different statistical measures. In this particular table, we just see mean scores for fall, winter, and spring over the course of a year. Also, as I said, quantitative data tends to be represented, especially when it's continuous data, it tends to be represented using a line graph. And line graphs in research, often you want to try to use a line graph. When you're using a line graph, you're trying to show how your intervention has affected learning. And in this case, in this example, you can see that the researcher actually plotted a goal line. So she had an anticipated expectation of the extent to which her particular teaching strategy or intervention was going to change scores. In this case, the correctly read words per minute and how her intervention was going to change that. And then she is now graphing data over the top of that, showing the actual outcome. And so from that, again, statistically, you can create a trend line, which again is just another statistical tool, but you can also simply plot the points to see where they fall, whether they're falling above or below the goal line. And again, this is the type of data analysis that all of us are familiar with. But one of the things that we should keep in mind is that with whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data, that when you're looking for change over time, the change over time is assuming that the change is attributable to a particular teaching strategy or an intervention. And oftentimes we know that, in fact, a difference in learning may be attributable to something completely outside what's happening in the classroom. So I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about qualitative data because, as I said, this session is going to focus mostly on qualitative data. When your data is qualitative, you look at analysis and you look at your analysis, you analyze data in very different ways. When I talk about qualitative data, I talk about using data collection methods like your class notes, the notes that you make for yourself after you've taught a lesson, the logs that you keep for your classroom, ways that you record interviews with students, whether those are audio recording or you're making notes after doing student interviews, conferences, when you meet with parents, when you meet with students and parents, how you're recording the outcomes of those sessions, or journals that you may keep. If you keep a teaching journal or a reflective journal, All of those are forms of qualitative data. Qualitative data also comes from open-ended questions that you might be attaching to surveys or questionnaires. Open-ended qualitative data also is collected in the form of self-assessments. If you have students do reflections on their learning, what they write is qualitative data. And again, there are ways to analyze that, not just to be able to see individual student progress, but to be able to aggregate that data and look at class data as well. So again, just a quick reminder of those data collection methods that we're talking about when we talk about quantitative data. In the textbook, the Hendricks book that you all have, she suggests or proposes 5 different phases that you would use to analyze quantitative data. And let me just say before I start that even though I'm going to be talking about these in a linear way, that these 5 phases, I think she calls them phases instead of steps, because in fact they could be quite iterative. You could do the compiling, the disassembling, the reassembling, and then find yourself going back to disassembling as you're discovering things you go through. So even though I'm going to talk about them as a set of steps rather than phases, do keep in mind that they're intended as phases and that you may actually go back and cycle back through different parts of these at different times. So the phases that she talks about are compiling, disassembling, reassembling, interpreting, and concluding. And again, I'm going to say just a little bit about each of those phases. So if we start with that first phase, which is compiling, here we're talking about compiling and preparing your data for analysis. And especially if you're using audio or video recordings, those types of data are going to need to be transcribed before they can be analyzed. In the case of video, you are not just going to be transcribing the audio part of the video, but you're also going to be adding notes about what is actually happening. Almost like the kinds of encryption that you get for people who are hearing impaired, so that you are visually impaired, so that you are actually describing what's happening in the video, along with, interspersed with that, the actual things that people are saying. Again, in order to analyze video and audio recordings, they do first need to be transcribed. All the rest of your data just needs to be organized. And if you are using student journals or student reflective pieces, you're going to want to kind of gather all those things together. You're going to want to decide if you're looking at every single one of those or if you're picking samples of those. Again, oftentimes, depending on your research method, if you have a lot of data to choose from, you may do a random sample of the data instead of looking at, for example, 200 student reflections. You may randomly select 50 for analysis. You might also do all 200. But again, it's at this stage that you make some of those decisions based on the research question that you're trying to answer. Phase 2 is disassembly. And in this stage, this means it refers to the idea of disassembling the data into smaller pieces or categories. And that process of disassembling and putting things into smaller pieces is called coding. Now, when you have, for any data that you have in digital form that you can transcribe, it's much easier to double code your data before you begin this process. You have lots of places to make notes. When we talk about coding categories, it's important to remember that these categories emerge from the data. So one of the things that you'll do is you'll just be reading through the data as a first step and making notes about the kinds of the things that you're seeing. And that will then begin to help you understand kind of the bigger themes or the bigger kinds of patterns that are emerging. However, you might have a research question where a researcher has actually proposed a model or a framework that you are working against. And you may actually simply code the data based on the elements of that model or framework. When you're doing this, as soon as you kind of assign a particular code or an idea to a piece of data, you're going to begin creating what is referred to as kind of a code book, and that is a series of examples of the kind of data that you're assigning a particular code to. Now, that's going to be really important because as you continue to read through additional pieces of data, whether they're from the same student or different student, you want to, in your mind, know what those examples are of that particular code or theme that you're identifying, so that you're coding things consistently. That also makes it possible for a second person to come and check your coding, because you not only have said what the code is, but you've given a lot of examples of what the code actually looks like in the student work or in the transcripts that you're looking at. If we look at phase three is reassembling the coded data into themes. And in this part of the process, a lot of researchers will actually use spreadsheets. And what they'll begin to do, especially if your data is in electronic form, or even if it's not in electronic form, you'll begin to you'll work with a spreadsheet with the code at the top, and then you're going to begin to list the examples or pull the examples out of the pieces of work. That there are lots of ways to do that. You can literally cut and paste the work, or you can assign kind of codes to the different pieces of data. What I mean by that is you have a piece of student work, and he's student number 3, and there are 12 different places in that student reflection where you've coded information. You may have 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, so you can go back to the actual piece of data and find that example of that coding that you did. And again, what a lot of people will do in this coding process, if you have electronic data, is simply cut and paste the data from, I shouldn't say cut and paste, copy and paste the data from its original source into the spreadsheet under the categories that you created. What that allows you to do is actually create a collection of all of the kind of the snippets or the quotes from the data that relate to a particular theme. And when you go back into the subsequent steps and you're trying to make sense of that, you're trying to synthesize it, you're trying to draw conclusions from it, it's just really helpful to have all of that in one place. So some ways that you might code data. When we talk about coding data, we're kind of assigning kind of a common idea, if you will, to themes that are in the data. And some examples, and these examples come from the Hendricks book. They're on page 156. For example, you might code your data by setting or context. So you might be interested in students talking about where things are happening or what part of the lesson things are happening in. And again, all of these things will depend on what your research question is. You may be coding things based on participants' perspective. So whenever a student expresses their own idea, their own perspective on what's happening, you may code those as perspectives. Students may define the situation or their understanding of what's going on. Students may give you indications of the way that they're thinking about something, the way that they're building their understanding. They may talk about the processes that they're using, the thinking processes, or literally their reaction to the processes that you're introducing for students to undertake whatever the task is. They might talk about events that happened over the course of the project. They may talk about the strategies that they're using, the learning strategies. And they may talk about different relationships, the roles that they had in the class, whether they were roles working independently or working collaboratively. They may talk about some of the behaviors that they exhibited or that they saw other students exhibiting. And again, the categories or themes that you select to code your data will be relevant to your research question. So there's no right or wrong way to code data. Remember, the reason you're coding data is to provide evidence or information that helps you say something about your research question. So again, the most important thing is that whatever codes you select to categorize your data under, that they relate to the research question. In phase 4, you are describing the reassembled data. And again, this is one of the cases where if you've assembled the data into a spreadsheet, it makes it very easy to look down the column of that spreadsheet and to look at all the responses that related to a certain category and begin to say things about them. This is also a place where if you've used a spreadsheet or another system like a spreadsheet, you can talk about the frequency that you're seeing some of those data. And for example, you might be able to say something about the most commonly cited ways of thinking or the most commonly cited events. You may be able to talk about the most commonly cited explanations for something, the most common reactions to things you did in your classroom. And again, you get that by first coding and then organizing that and then looking for and describing those patterns. Like all the other phases, this phase is described by your research question. So you shouldn't spend time talking about and interpreting data that's not related to your research question. Again, that's a big part of the coding, is to pick out what things that you're hearing that are related to your question, versus which things you're hearing that are just kind of the background noise, the things that students are talking about or they may be reflecting on or noting, but they're not related to your question. This is all about picking out the things that are related to your question so you can better answer what the question is. Phase 5 is drawing conclusions by relating that data that you interpreted to the research question. It's important to remember that your conclusions have to be contextualized. And what I mean by that is that your conclusions will be things that are about what your class said about their experience of a certain teaching strategy that you delivered in a certain way. Whenever you are drawing conclusions around your quantitative or qualitative data, you're not proving something. And I think that you see the distinction there. What you're going to be doing is you're creating usable knowledge. You're creating knowledge that you can apply to your teaching practice. Again, you're not creating knowledge that anyone can use, because whatever your strategy was, whatever your intervention was, the research piece is at this point is specific to your students who experienced the thing that you delivered in the way that you selected to do it. All right. Again, those 5 phases of the process: compiling, disassembling, reassembling, interpreting, and concluding. Now we're going to spend the rest of the session talking about phase 2 and phase 3, disassembling and reassembling. And as it turns out, those 2 parts were the focus of the learning log activity that you did. I wanted first but give you just a little bit more in-depth background around those 2, because there are a lot of approaches that you can use to disassembling the data and reassembling the data. Again, disassembling involves identifying codes and taking it apart. Reassembling involves putting all the similarly coded things back together. And so I want to talk a little bit about the possible differences between substantive codes and selective codes, and also talk about give some specific examples of how you would use those in data. And we're going to use the actual data from the learning log to do this. So if we start with step 1, step 1 involves coding the data with substantive codes. And in this case, the term substantive, it refers to the initial conceptual categories that you see in the data. In some ways, it's kind of a shorthand or a condensed version of what the respondents said. And again, you're focusing on only those parts of what they said that are relevant to your research question. And again, I can't emphasize enough how difficult this step of the process is. In fact, it's impossible if you don't have a good understanding of the research question and what it is you are trying to demonstrate. So as an example of step 1, this piece of data, this is response number 24 from the Learning Log 8.1. And again, these were responses, open-ended responses. This was a survey to teachers, and the question was, what major factors led you into teaching? And so just from the research question, one of the things that we can tell is the types of things that we want to find to code for are factors that led people into teaching. There may be a lot of other information in people's responses, but the only thing that we're interested in is information that sheds light on this idea of what major factors led them into teaching. So this is open-ended response number 24, and it says that summers off are important when raising family and dealing with children. Now, again, a substantive code is a shorthand for what the person already said. And just as an example, and these are not the only possibilities that you could come up with, the substantive codes that arise from this statement is summers off and time for family. In this particular case, you can see summers off is a direct word-for-word quote from their response, whereas time for family it's a little bit of an interpretation of what they said. Substantive codes can be direct quotes or they can be slight interpretations, but they should be accurate interpretations. It is important to keep that in mind. All right, let's look at another one. This is response number 63. And response number 63, I always wanted to work with students. Having major holidays did not hurt either. And so here, the substantive codes desire to work with students. And again, this is a slight interpretation, and holidays off. And again, that's fairly direct, but it is a slight interpretation. The next step is to create selective codes. And what I mean by selected codes are, I mean themes that are represented by the substantive codes. So you'll have a whole series of substantive codes that emerge from this process of going through all those responses and literally kind of just reinterpreting what the response have said in kind of a shorthand. Then you want to look at those shorthand versions and say, right, do these begin to group under some bigger themes? So again, if we go back to our example, number 63, I always wanted to work with students having major holidays off did not hurt either. The substantive codes that we selected here was desire to work with students and holidays off. Oh, you went back, I'm sorry. No wonder it doesn't make any sense. I thought we just did that. So here, if we now pull together that list of substantive codes, so from all of the things that we just looked at, we saw that we had summers off, we had time for family, desire to work with students, and holidays off. And one of the things we noticed is that we could group summers off, time with family, and holidays off, and we could retitle those things work-life balance. Now, desire to work with students doesn't quite fit with work-life balance. So desire to work with students, if we only had these four categories, would remain its own category because it doesn't fit into the other category. But now we've taken four different substantive codes and we've turned them into two: desire to work with students and work-life balance. Now you can see that the reason that you would want to do this is that if you're actually trying to quantify the data and if you're trying to find those major factors, that summers off, time for family, and holidays off may not be separate factors. They may actually be part of this bigger factor, which is termed in this case work-life balance. So if we go back and we recode with the selected code, we're going to go back first to question number 24. Number 24, if you remember, had two different substantive codes. But this time, summers off, important when raising family, dealing with children, turns into one selected code of work-life balance. If we look at question number 63, which had two substantive codes, I always wanted to work with students and having major holidays did not hurt either. Here again, we have kept desire to work with students because that was distinctly different, and we've used the substantive code work-life balance. So we still get two codes out of this response. All right, so step 4 involves listing those selected codes along with the illustrative examples. And this is what I was saying before. If our code is work-life balance, and now our examples of that would include anytime people talk about having summers off, having time for family, or having holidays off. What this allows you to do as a researcher is to go back and look at all that data again from scratch and recode it. And it pretty much, it should ensure that there's consistency between the way that you coded the data the first time and the second time, because not only do you have a set of codes, but you have some concrete examples. It also allows you to invite another researcher or a colleague to do the same thing, to kind of verify your coding so that they would use the same selected codes and examples, they would code the data, and you can look at it to see if they have achieved the same responses that you did. Those two types of activities, the first one you're actually seeing if you code the data the same time 2 times is called inter-observer reliability. And when you're comparing your responses to a colleague's responses, that's called intra-observer reliability. And in your research project, it could be a very important thing to be able to demonstrate. All right, so we're going to now focus our attention on your responses to Learning Log 8.1. And if you could pull that up or just kind of have that accessible, we are going to do a think, pair, share. So you've already done the thinking bit. You've recorded some responses, I hope, to Learning Log 8.1. What we're going to do in a moment is I'm going to ask you by Skype to join one of the other people on the course. And I'm going to ask you to discuss the questions that appear at the bottom of the first page of Learning Log 8.1. So again, for reference, they are there. I will also leave them up on the screen so you can see them throughout your discussion. For today's discussion, I am going to ask Chris and Anjali to join up. And I know that, Anjali, that you have 30 minutes left. We are going to finish a little bit early today, so you will do most of the discussion. And I'm going to ask Stephanie and Barbara if you would join up by Skype. Again, I'm going to give you 20 minutes to go through those questions. And when you're done, we're going to just do kind of a little bit of group sharing. We're going to do the same questions, and we're going to go through them one or two at a time. And I'd like to hear about what you discussed or what you recorded individually when you initially worked on Learning Log 8.1. So again, we will tell you when there is 10 minutes remaining. We will tell you when there is 2 minutes remaining. You'll see the screens shift. Again, Barbara and Stephanie and Anjali and Chris are the pairs today. If you would like to go ahead and get started, if you have any questions as you're going through, please raise your hand or type something into the text box, and we'll respond to you. We're going to turn your microphones off just so it's a little bit quieter where you are and so that you can use your devices more easily. Are there any questions at this point? If you have a question, please raise your hand.
What did you say, Ben? Me and Stephanie.
Barbara and Stephanie, Chris and Anjali.
Okay.
All right, so again, watch for the screen to change. It'll change at 10 minutes, it'll change at 2 minutes, and then we'll call you back after 20 minutes. Go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. If everybody's ready, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right, so what I'd like to do is go through those questions a pair at a time as they appeared in the bullets. And again, if you could raise your hand if you'd like to either share your individual responses with us or share what you talked about with the person who you were speaking with this afternoon. So our first set of questions, did you both generate the same categories, and how did your categories differ if they were not the same? Again, if you could raise your hand and share what you talked about. Stephanie, go ahead, please.
I didn't raise my hand, but okay.
Somebody raised your hand.
We did. Sorry?
Somebody raised your hand.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize. We did. We had the same categories, basically, with the exception of one. So there was one kind of anomaly that was just one response, a one-off, that I did code and Barbara didn't code. But other than that, we did have the same categories.
Okay. What about Chris or Anjali?
I'm happy to answer. I just didn't know if Anjali wanted to get it out of her way before she had to leave.
Yeah, you can go ahead, please.
Anjali, I think we had very similar categories, except Anjali had sort of classed enjoyment or love and enjoyment as one whole category, whereas I'd subset it into love of learning, love of the subject. So I further divided it out. So I think that was probably our main difference.
Okay.
Hang on, I started ticking them off and then I sort of lost interest. Oh, and then where we had sort of Anjali had personal reasons, whereas I'd sort of put fits around family or personal life. But they were very similar, pretty much.
Great, thank you. And I hope that by doing the exercise that you can see that again, once you have your categories and once you have the examples of the kinds of things that fit in your categories, that it would be very easy to hand off that set of data to someone else and have them use your codes and your examples to do that exact same exercise. And with any luck, to do that in a way that would yield a very consistent result to the way that you had coded the data. We're going to move on to the next two questions. And the questions are that for similar categories, how much agreement was there about the percent of responses in each category? So again, here what you were doing is you first coded them, you looked at the frequency of that coded response, and you looked at those as a percentage of all the responses. And the second part of this is what were the top 5 categories? So if you'd like to respond to either or both of those questions, can we go over to either Stephanie or Barbara first?
Want me to do it, Barbara?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. There was agreement in terms of the highest percentage in categories, and the top categories that I had. This is my wording. sorry. The first was that they wanted to make a difference in the lives of children or students. The second was the love of children and working with children. The third was that they had had a positive role model in their life that had motivated them, positive or negative, I guess, but usually a positive role model. The fourth was the schedule. That's how I termed time for family or fitting around their children's schedule and summers off, holiday. I lumped it all together. And then the fifth was that they like teaching and or learning.
Great, thank you. And then what about either Anjali or Chris? What were your top 5?
Well, I think Anjali has to go, so I'll start talking so that she can duck out when she needs to.
Okay.
Thank you.
We had a slight difference in the way that we sort of tallied the data. We did talk about how we did that. Obviously, I ended up with a bar chart because I like bar charts. And data, I got all excited. It's like, yeah, now see, I did love of working with children, but that was my number 1, and that came up as over 50%. And then a particular subject, so for me, the top 5 were love of working with children, then to make a difference, which was just under 30%, previous role model in their life, just over 20%, fitting around family or personal life was about just under 15%, and then love of the subject was above the fitting around the family life and personal life. Love of particular. If I'd had more time, I would have moved it so that it was sort of properly staggered. That one there is really bothering me.
Yeah.
But I restricted myself to lunchtime today. So,
No, that's fine. I think that it's interesting.
Sorry, what was that, Barbara?
You just like Stephanie. Oh my God.
High five, Stephanie.
So I think that it's interesting that even though you coded all of those things independently, that in the end your coding categories were fairly similar, and even the things that made it into your top 5 were very similar. Again, this was a fairly simple, straightforward question, and you could imagine that as questions become a bit more complex, or as the possible responses become a little bit wider in scope, that this task would become a bit more challenging. But one of the important things to do in setting these open-ended questions is to actually set the questions so that you get a range of responses that are easily coded and categorized. And by doing an exercise like this, not only have you now had a little bit of experience of coding and quantifying coding, but when you flip that around again, it will help you pick the types of data collection you're going to do. And if you did pick things with open-ended questions, you can really see the benefits of having a very focused open-ended question related to your research question, but with an open-ended question where you've thought a lot about the number of different kinds of responses that you might be getting. What about the last question? So that for similar categories, how much agreement exists about which particular responses belong to which categories? Did any of you find that you had some categories that you had included responses that maybe the other person didn't quite agree with? And again, Stephanie, your example of this idea of coding something as the schedule to include a whole range of things that had to do with time for other things, the breaks, time for family. Were there other kind of areas where you had kind of differences in agreement in terms of what things belonged in that category? Stephanie?
There wasn't a case of a disagreement about what should be in a category. The only difference that we had, which I mentioned, was that I did code that one-off response about I needed a job, and Barbara thought, oh, there was only one of them, so she ignored it. So that's the only thing that was kind of the difference about it. So, but then I only had one of those types of responses. So I coded it because it was different to all the rest, but she just thought, oh, it doesn't fit, so I just won't do it. That was the only difference that we had.
That's great. And Stephanie, that brings up a really important point, that one of the reasons that you ask open-ended questions is not necessarily just to get back responses that you could have predicted in advance. one of the real advantages of using an open-ended question is you actually can get some responses that you did not anticipate. And always, or typically, those responses will not, that there won't be so many of those that you can quantify them so that they're never going to kind of move into your top 5 reasons why someone went into teaching. But it is important to be able to collect those because those actually may, in some cases, give you information for the next research question. So those kind of, those areas that are, that have emerged as part of the question that you didn't predict as part of the question often will inform the next round of research. So this idea that someone would simply go into teaching because they needed a job doesn't really conform to these top 5 reasons, all these kind of really commendable reasons why people go into teaching, but recognizing that there are reasons outside those that draw people into the profession. So again, the open-ended response gives you both things that you anticipate, plus it gives you things you don't anticipate. Anyone else?
Anjali and I mean, we discussed how we categorized, and we talked about the fact that she'd sort of identified each individual statement. So she'd come up with her different code categories, and she'd then put the number of the statement under each code that she felt it applied for. Whereas I did more of a sort of, I think it's in one of the books as well, I sort of like highlighted the key statements that I decided were buzzwords and then put them in that way and then did a tally and then transposed that in Excel. What it did lead to, though, was we went off subject and started talking about the purpose of the data. So, for example, if you were asked to collect this information to inform future interviewing panels for a prospective teacher, then actually it's very important to know that what the sort of general answers are, so that when you ask someone, so tell me, why are you interested in teaching? If they turn around to you and say, because I need a job, is that something that we should be worried about, or is it something we're thinking, well, at least they're not going to leave after a year because their work-life balance isn't what they were expecting? You know, it is actually quite a valid point to put in, and how much you subcategorize that is going to be affected by the audience and the purpose of the research in the first place.
Yeah.
But that was kind of that's when we decided that maybe we should stop because we were getting a little bit sidetracked, we thought so.
Yeah, yeah, and as I said, sometimes those unexpected questions or unexpected responses lead to new questions. And for example, one of the questions that it may lead to is, are there certain kinds of areas of university training that don't necessarily prepare you for a specific job? And so, one of the reasons that someone might go into teaching would be possibly because they were, I shouldn't actually say this, but they might actually have majored in something like English or philosophy, and they were not able to find a profession that related to their particular area of interest in those areas. And so teaching then became the thing that related. And even though you would have expected those people may have had other reasons for going into teaching, needing a job could very well have been one of those. Chris, I just wanted to ask one more question for clarification. So when you looked at your individual responses, were you saying that within your responses that you may have actually seen more than one theme in a person's response, and so you would have actually pulled out 2 instead of looking at the statement and saying, right, I want to pick out the most important one of the statement, or the one that...
In this case, I felt it was very difficult to identify which was their strongest theme. So that's my children being delivered. Come in, boys. Hiya, the iPad's there. And there you go, sweetheart.
You see them dancing today.
For me, it was the same too. I had between one. I had between
my
one and
job, the one that I went into teaching for, just work-life balance. Okay, darling, there's a second there. Give me 1 sec. Sorry, I completely lost my thread.
Yes,
so
Chris,
what I did.
Chris, one of the things I was just going to throw out is that, especially when your data is in electronic form and it's very easy to manipulate, oftentimes what you can do is you can go to like a person's individual response, and typically, I mean, I was actually surprised that most of these responses were so short, because sometimes if you use an open-ended question, you might actually say that your open-ended question is limited to 50 words or 60 words, or if you're using a form where you can give a word limit, so that if someone types in 5 paragraphs, they're not able to submit that as their response.
Yeah.
If it's possible, though, for someone to express more than one idea in their response, what you can do is and it's very advisable, is actually to separate those into sub-responses. So participant one actually gave 3 responses instead of 1 response, because when you coded them, you actually found that they were giving you 3 different ideas. And again, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And what you would do in your data analysis is that you would say that you had 32 responses from 32 individuals, and within the respondents, what they said that there was 166 discrete responses. So that if each person gave multiple responses, you would then use that 166 as your total responses in order to calculate percentages, not the number of people who had responded to the survey.
Okay, so so in which case my percentages would then be based on the number of responses that I counted in total.
That's right. It would be based on the number of discrete responses rather than the number of respondents.
Okay.
Yep. And again, that's a very typical thing to do with open-ended questions, because very seldom will you just get one answer in an open-ended question. All right, guys. Well, I hope that gave you kind of just a bit of a taster. Actually, there's one more question. How did you handle responses that stated more than one factor? That's what we've just been talking about. I apologize. I didn't advance the slides as we were doing that. So again, that's just been a quick taster into looking at qualitative data. I'm hoping that all of you now have some ideas for how you would actually code responses that students give you. You might even think about, what would you do with all those pieces of reflective writing that students do? Is there a way to actually take those pieces of reflective writing and code them to get a better idea of the kinds of things that students are talking about? So not just looking at what individuals are saying and comparing a student reflection, from the beginning of the year versus the middle of the year, but how do you look at a class set of reflections to give you a better idea about what the things are talking about in those reflections? Does anyone have any questions or comments that they want to add to today's session?
It was fun.
Nope. Yeah, it was fun, actually. It was fun doing something practical.
Great. I'll let Latifa.
Okay, so we're nearly at the end of the session. So just want to remind you that there is a learning log 8.2 if you do want to record your learning points. Ben sent out materials for session 9 yesterday, so hopefully you've all received those. I'll be posting the video online. If not tomorrow, then it'll happen on Thursday morning. Just we've got an event tomorrow, so if it's not up, if you don't hear from me by Thursday, do let me know. But I aim to give you the video for today's session and the joining instructions at the latest by Thursday morning.
Yeah, I know that in the directions for session 9, that when I went back to check the links, there was at least one link that was no longer working. So I apologize for that. But as I said in the direction, that if there's ever a question about what the most important thing is to read, because I like to give you options of different things to read, although they all tend to be they're about similar topics, even though they're options. The most important thing to read would always be to go back to the textbook that we gave you, the Hendricks book. That is really the best reference, and I'm confident that the language and just the content of that is accessible to everyone who's in the course this time. So do use that book as the primary reading if you do want to go and do the background reading. Thank you all again for joining. We look forward to catching up with you again in a week.
Thank you very much.
Have a good week.
Okay.